Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to On the Middle East after a longish pause. I was in Northeast Syria covering the conflict between the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, and the Syrian National Army. That's fortunately ended, mainly thanks to US diplomacy. The SDF signed a ceasefire agreement with the government on January 30th in Damascus. But it's far more than just a ceasefire. It sets the parameters for the integration of the SDF and Kurdish-led civilian structures in the northeast into the national government. The Kurds wanted far more. They wanted constitutionally guaranteed self-rule or federation. That's not on the cards, but they still got more than the Kurds in Turkey, for example, have. It's in effect the start of a new chapter for the Kurds in Syria. With me here to discuss these momentous developments is Meghan Bodette, Director of Research at the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington, D.C. Meghan joined me from Iraqi Kurdistan. So welcome to our show, Meghan. It's so kind of you to join us because I know you're really, really busy at the moment.
Thank you so much, Amber, and it's very kind of you to have me back on the podcast.
So we've both just been in Northeast Syria, Rojava, and some very dramatic events unfolded as we were there. Now, Meghan, I want us to look forward rather than go on about, what could have been, what should have been. So can we say that this is the beginning of a new chapter, a new era in Northeast Syria? And what are the sort of parameters of this new era? Who are the main actors going forward?
Well, looking forward is all we can do. And I think certainly when you have a deal that has averted a war, like this one has, looking forward at options for peace is the most productive thing. I think that this sets new parameters for both the Syrian transition and the regional Kurdish question. We're looking at an agreement that has the outlines of a start to the recognition and possible delineation of Kurdish areas in Syria. There's one article, I believe Article 10 of the deal, that does mention that Syria has Kurdish areas in the context of the army not entering those regions. We're looking at a specific, administrative and military reforms and integration in the province of Hasaka. We're looking at the creation of a brigade in the new military for the region of Kobani. Also, the absorption of the autonomous administrations there into state institutions. And we're looking at possible reforms and new appointments in areas like Serikani, Afrin, and Sheikh Maksud as well. That's in the final point of the agreement. So there's specific steps to be taken that are going to bring the military and political structures that exist into the scope of the state in areas where there is a Kurdish population. There's also a political track going ahead. One thing that's very interesting is that in this 14-point ceasefire agreement, there were 2 points specifically that mention education, Kurdish language education being one of the main achievements of the Rojava project, an entire generation educated in Kurdish schools, and something that many Kurdish people want to keep. There's a provision that recognizes the diplomas granted by those Kurdish language educational institutions. And there's one that mentions continuing discussions on the educational specificity of those areas. So we've got a path forward for further negotiations on things like, the use of the Kurdish language. That's also implicitly reflected in other areas of public life and public services by keeping on these autonomous administration employees who, as we know, are using Kurdish. And from, the conversations that I've been having with people and some of the diplomatic activity we've been seeing, like the KNC delegation that went to Damascus today, it looks like there will be ongoing discussions about the position of Kurdish rights in the constitution. That can be something that not just the former YPG or SDF, but a wider group of Kurdish parties may be engaging on. And of course, you saw the same people out in the same streets that I did. When you have this outpouring of Kurdish national sentiment, these people standing up for something that they had built, however imperfect, this is not a people that backs down easily. And I think that as political actors in a peaceful country, they'll be in many ways even more formidable because they won't be so busy with the basic details of how to survive. So while there are certainly threats ahead, I think we all read that excellent Wall Street Journal piece about how the ceasefire broke down. I think that there's a path for, Kurds to be a legal and recognized part of the state and be in a very good position to gain some of the rights that they do want. Because I think we also do have to recognize this agreement doesn't fully cover, most of all people's aspirations.
No, it certainly doesn't. And that's the criticism. But then that begs the question of what leverage the Kurds actually had, what real leverage they had. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on that score, because what basically dramatically upended the balance was the fact that the Assad regime was overthrown, and then that the United States threw in its lot with this new government. So back to my question of the new actors. You mentioned the KNC, and for our audience, that's the Kurdish National Congress, which is an umbrella group for all the opposition parties, opposition to the ruling Democratic Unity Party, the PYD. And so now we see those two groups working together, right? And we can assume that the KNC is acting in concert with the PYD and the Rojava administration, right?
Yeah, I think we can say that there's a level of coordination there. It looks like they've been meeting. Their unity delegation recently met with the Dem Party, with a delegation from the KNK, the Kurdistan National Congress from Europe. So it definitely seems like there's a unified strategy there, which is something that's very important for Kurdish gains, as we can probably get into later in the podcast.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
So moving forward, we're seeing Kurdish unity for one, which you mentioned, but Kurdish unity across the borders, right? Can you comment a bit on that phenomenon? Because from what I witnessed, that's really the rising, overarching trend, dynamic in Northeast Syria. And I guess we can pronounce the Democratic Confederalism project pretty much dead, or am I wrong on that score?
Well, I think that the Kurdish unity that we have seen is really something unprecedented. That's not just a conclusion I'm reaching. When I speak to Kurdish people, whether in Qamishlo or in Erbil, in Suleymaniye, to friends, in the Kurdish regions of Turkey, they all say too that they have never seen anything like this, that this surpasses even kind of the moment of unity that you had in 2014 and 2015 against ISIS. When you talk to people and you ask them, what is your message that you would want to convey to Kurdish policymakers? They say work together. When you listen to the chants in the streets, what they say is yeke, 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 gele Kurd yeke, which means one, one, one. The Kurdish people is one, right? So this is a real grassroots driven message. It's coming from not just, the very admirable efforts of political parties to try to forge a common strategy, which we've seen efforts on that over the past year, the KRG moving towards that, the autonomous administration and the PYD moving towards that. But this is really a grassroots sentiment too. And I think when we want to talk about leverage, one reason why this January 30th deal was a bit better than the January 18th deal that preceded it In addition to, of course, some pushback in the Congress and in parts of the US administration, and, the very valuable mediation by the Iraqi Kurdish leadership, was the fact that I think the Syrians, the Turks, and the guarantor parties saw that when Syrian Kurdish areas were under threat, not only did people of all different political views in the Kurdish regions come together, but, young people from Suleimania, from Erbil, took to the streets and protested. People climbed over the border wall at Nusaybin. You've seen that border wall. That's not something easy to do. It's very militarized, to join the defenders of the Kurdish regions. People came from the Kurdistan region of Iraq to do that as well. One young man from Kirkuk was announced to have been killed in action. So this sort of pan-Kurdish mobilization, I think, strengthens the weak hand that the Kurdish leadership in Syria had, and, can account for, I think, some of those improvements. But yeah, I think, look, the future of Kurdish politics is going to be, a situation where increasingly Kurds don't see themselves as, part only of the one country that they're in, but as part of a nation, across these borders. You've had this sort of turn in Kurdish politics more recently towards looking towards Ankara, looking towards Damascus, looking towards Baghdad. And I think that you're going to have that continue to go on. You have real opportunities to be political actors at the national level. I think that's something that this agreement does provide. But I think we've now seen in this moment a sort of synthesis of that idea that, okay, you can be a political actor in the country that you live, in the country in which you live. But also, if something happens to Kurds in one part, Kurds in other parts of Kurdistan will be ready to stand with them. And I actually think that strengthens their hand, in these national capitals, because they're seen as a force with leverage in many places. So I think that sort of turn towards kind of, renewed nationalism is a trend that we're going to see. And I think that, the Democratic Confederalist Project, much of that idea was the idea that if you have a certain level of political organization at the local level, the borders don't matter so much. And I think we actually could be moving towards something where that is in some ways realized. Goodness knows the kind of cross-border connections we'll see if that Nusaybin border gate is opened for trade.
For our audience, that's the border gate with Turkey that's remained closed for all these years.
Yeah. So I think, some of those ideas will still hold a place. I think we've seen that the role of women is a part of that political project that's going to stay. You saw the demonstrations, women and men together are out in the streets. And there was a massive outpouring of support for the Kurdish female fighters in the YPJ, in Northeast Syria, after a video was released showing a government-affiliated fighter with the cut-off braid of a Kurdish fighter, presumably who had been killed. We saw people braiding their hair. In a protest in Erbil just a few days ago, they made a giant braid in the colors of the Kurdish flag and, hung it from the Erbil citadel. So I think the role of women that's been pioneered in the Rojava model is something that's very much there to stay. And I think that the part of the sort of democratic confederalist or Öcalanist movement that has failed here, and that will be questioned and overcome, is the sort of reliance on a very 20th century vanguardist way of thinking. The whole 2004 new paradigm, when the movement shifted away from a sort of Marxist-Leninist concept of, a national liberation war for an independent socialist Kurdish state, towards this kind of rejection of the nation state. It wasn't really the idea of a nation and, its ability to govern itself that was necessarily the thing that had to be rejected. But some of those old-fashioned ideas of a very centralized vanguardist state, that was a little bit more of what had sort of outlived its purpose. And when we look at how Northeast Syria kind of lost its hand in these negotiations, I think we can look at things like very centralized practices that were kind of against this whole ideology in the way that places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor were governed. I talked about this, I think, the last time I was on your podcast. So I think if this moment has Kurds thinking a little bit more about, the transnational Kurdish nation, across these different borders, that is something that will be very positive. And some of these applications of local democracy and overcoming the nation state will still work. But I think that that movement is going to have to think a little bit about how very rigid and dogmatic ways of thinking and governing led to this kind of failure. There's a lot of criticism, on the Kurdish public right now. And I think if they want to have a political future, that criticism is going to have to be heard.
And also the fact that Abdullah Öcalan is sacrosanct and that you can't criticize anything he says or does, certainly not to the people who, follow him, who consider themselves to be part of the movement that he leads. I think that's also been part of the problem. Or what would you have to say on that, Meghan?
I think that there has been, when we look at politics, in this region, when you have a people that's existed under authoritarian states, which is true not only for Kurds, but for, many of the peoples of the Middle East, they've gone through colonialism, they've gone through dictatorship. And then in the Kurdish case, you have the sort of double colonialism of, the division of the region by the French and the British, and then ruling parties, like Ba'athist Iraq, Ba'athist Syria, the military regimes in Turkey, the Islamic Republic, and the Shah before that in Iran, that then kind of deny Kurds political agency. The sort of critical thinking and free critique that people very much take for granted in free societies is suppressed. And that is, a sort of systematic issue. And of course, and you have a society that's been oppressed for a very long time, that has not been able to lead and govern itself. When a movement like the PKK and a leader like Öcalan comes out of that society, people latch onto that. People say, okay, this for the first time, we have a leader who is ours, right? We have a movement that is ours. There's a lot of attachment to the Kurdish leaders and the Kurdish national struggles of different Kurdish movements as well. People in the Kurdistan region of Iraq feel very strongly in a lot of ways about Masoud Barzani and Mustafa Barzani, of course, his father. One thing that's interesting on these demonstrations, looking at kind of people's imagery and discussions of Kurdish leadership, is you see a lot of imagery of the Republic of Kurdistan in Mahabad and Qazi Muhammad, who was the leader of that short-lived Kurdish state who was executed by the Iranians in 1946. So, this kind of attachment to these movements and their leaders is a result of the disenfranchisement that people have gone through. And I think that, in the context of kind of the criticism that you mentioned, this sort of dogmatism that we've been talking about, I think a lot of things are going to be reevaluated. I think that people, with the peace process, the dissolution of the PKK, and now the situation in Rojava, I think people are going to have a lot of conversations about where this movement will go, what its supporters will do. And, when you look at these past 40, 50 years of Kurdish politics in that political tradition, they've weathered a lot. They've changed, and they've been people who've been able to criticize and, open up to mistakes, own up to mistakes.
So there are lots of paradoxes, though, at the same time. For example, today, the nationalist leader in Turkey, Devlet Bahçeli, once again spoke about offering amnesty to Öcalan, freedom to Selahattin Demirtas, who is that very charismatic and popular Kurdish leader who's been in prison since 2016. The critique of Öcalan among those who never liked him is that he's been cooperating with the Turkish state, and that in extension, the Syrian Kurds ended up following his orders, which was pretty much to sort of agree to fold in to the Syrian state rather than resist. So how do we sort of unpack all of that? What does that mean going forward? For example, for someone like Mazlum Kobani, the commander-in-chief of the SDF, who's really emerged as this very, very popular figure, not just in Northeast Syria, but in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Turkey. Do you see him as the new leader? And what do you think his strategy will be going forward? Will we see a much closer alignment now between him and Ankara and Öcalan?
I think that that's a great question. And I think that, in the end, the leaders of all of this are the people, right? I think one thing that has obscured many analyses of what's exactly going on in Northeast Syria, kind of on all sides, is that movements, armed groups, political parties don't fall down from the sky. They have social bases that exist because of a certain set of conditions that people are going through, right? And when you have, problems, contradictions, issues that people feel are unresolved, even if a particular party, a particular movement, or a particular leader dissolves or is defeated or simply becomes unpopular because it has failed to deliver, those demands still exist, the people still exist. This is why one thing that's very important about this deal is that it preserves the Syrian Kurdish population on the land where they live. They have a place, from which they can organize another day and participate in politics. So if, this deal is implemented in a way where Kurdish demands aren't satisfied, you still will have a community that will be willing to organize for, and, God forbid it comes to that, fight for their rights and their safety. And that might not be under something similar to the YPG or the PKK. People might say, to those leaders and those movements, okay, you haven't delivered enough for us. We don't want to support you anymore. They might go somewhere else. It's been a very long time in Kurdistan without any new political parties. I can't say, that will happen or what will happen with any of the existing ones, but as long as you have a social base that has unsatisfied demands, there will always be some kind of entity that will kind of rise up to meet that. And I think, going back to what we previously talked about and returning to this question of what somebody like General Mazloum will do, he said in an interview on Ronahi TV, I believe the night of the 30th, that his plan to stay among his people, not to take a position in the new government, and to work on Kurdish unity. He's a figure who's excelled at that. He's been someone, to my understanding, he's been leading the autonomous administration's efforts to sort of reconcile with the KNC. He's been received very well in Erbil among the Iraqi Kurdish leadership. I'll never forget last year in January, I was in Qamishlo, the day that it was announced that he had met with Masoud Barzani. I didn't know this. I had been at work all day. I go home, I'm at my friend's house, and suddenly there's gunfire outside. And, being a Westerner, still unused to this celebratory gunfire thing, I'm like, is everything okay? What happened? And my friend's mother is like, oh, that's the Hevals and the PDK. So the, PYD and the KDP. And I'm like, dear God, are they fighting? What could they possibly be fighting about? And she laughs. She's like, no, no, no. People are celebrating because General Mazloum met with Masoud Barzani today. So the people really want unity. Mazloum has been somebody who's been kind of leading the charge on delivering that. And it's a sign of, I think, hope that there will be political space for Kurds in the new Syria, that he's willing to, work on meeting that moment and taking that kind of action. So I think that when we look at the future of Kurdish politics and the people who are now in the parties and the positions that they are, I think that they're going to be forced by grassroots demands to, again, think about pan-Kurdish interests in their engagement, with the national capitals in the states where they live, to think about, the Kurdish rights and fundamental demands, in their engagement with Kurds in other parts, to help when they can help, which we've seen Kurds from other parts of Kurdistan, even in their very difficult conditions, doing so much to help Rojava right now. And I think that people who support the PYD, the PKK, the KDP, they're going to be looking at their leaders now and they're going to be saying, unify. I've talked to many people, like you said, this is what they say when you ask them, what would you tell your policymakers? So I think there's going to be pressure from the public to work together. And I think that the message that Kurdish leaders across the ideological spectrum have gotten from these events is that at the end of the day, actors who are hostile to Kurdish existence don't care if you're a PKK member or a KDP member. They care that Kurds are trying to assert, a certain level of self-determination and demands for their rights. They've also seen, on the positive side, that when Kurds are united, this can have an impact even in very difficult situations. That lesson wasn't fully internalized, I think, on all sides after the war against ISIS, but I think it might be more internalized now. So I would assume that for the Kurdish leadership in Northeast Syria in the new phase, a new strategy is going to be focusing on, Kurdish interests within Syria, on national unity, on, bringing people together across the political divides and across the borders. And I think that's a strategy that could create a really formidable political actor that would then be in a position to work with other people in Syria who want to see something different from the sort of path the government is taking now.
I totally agree with you. And I think that is very much what the Kurdish leadership in Syria should be doing now is building those kinds of alliances, creating new partners, and trying to bring Sunni Arabs, who are the biggest component in Syria, to their own region to invest, to have, a vested interest in those areas so that they will in turn become, the defenders of the Kurds
Mhm.
in the capital, if and when warranted. I think it's very important. And of course, al-Shara, okay, for the moment, he seems to be in the ascendant. Everybody seems to love him, Donald Trump and all the European leaders. But who's to say that there won't be other figures emerging and who, Syrians might coalesce around together with somebody like Muslim Kobani who have a different vision for the future of Syria. Not all Sunni Arabs are enamored of him, and we certainly know the Druze and the Alawites have massive problems. So going forward, I think bridge building and, of course, trying to build a strong and resilient economy will be some of the biggest priorities. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Meghan. It was great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Amber.
And that's it for today. For more in-depth coverage of the Kurds and of Syria, go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.